Welcome to Revitalize and Replant with Mark Clifton, where we equip pastors to take their churches from declining to thriving by pointing them to a new future and a new hope. Join us weekly for encouragement and practical advice in your pastoring journey.
Well, hello, and welcome back to Revitalize and Replant Replant and Revitalize with Mark Clifton.
I thought we renamed it.
I thought so too.
Because if when things get stuck, you just change the name. Right?
That's what I was thinking.
That's
about,
right.
You know?
So all you got to do is change the name of a church, and then all those lost people who are waiting for you to change the name will show up.
Well, whatever our name is, it's with Mark Clifton, who's sitting right there.
I am
dogging me. For having an old person's moment.
That's right.
And then there's Mark Hallock sitting right there.
Hey guys.
I'm Dan Hurst. And actually, I'm not. I'm Kyle Bierman. I'm the one that had the little brain mess there.
That's right.
And yeah, we forgot to mention that Kyle is here also.
Kyle is here, passing out the water and the candy.
Let's talk a little bit about. Somebody asked me the other day, how's things going? At your church.
Yeah.
And and I said, well, it's we're supposedly growing, but I don't see much happening.
Uh-huh.
And the truth of the matter is, what I'm seeing happen is that there are people coming, but there are people leaving at the same time. So we're not really growing, but we're not really in a valley, but we've plateaued.
Yeah.
That's the word that we love to toss around.
Yeah.
And a lot of churches have reached that moment where they they all do. Every church goes through that cycle, if you will, of plateauing. And we thought it would be a great time this morning to just take a moment and talk about something that our friend Chuck Lawless has addressed, and that is, what do you do? Well, the 10 reasons why churches get stuck or why they stop growing. Why they
stuck
plateau.
churches. I mean, we get that all the time where churches, we're just in its doldrums, right? I've been reading a lot of things lately about ocean travel and sailing ships, and when they would cross the equator, there's this place called the doldrums where there's no wind at all, none, and it's so hot down there, and they could last for days with just no wind, no movement, just and they call that the doldrums. There's a lot of churches that are in the doldrums. It's just not really declining, but not going anywhere. Yeah. And you just kind of every day, going through the same thing, and no one's really growing spiritually. You're not seeing any impact in the community. You're not seeing any new converts made. No one's really leaving. The church isn't in decline. It's just like in the doldrums, You're not really moving. Yeah. You're stuck. And what do you do about that? And really, our friend Chuck Lawless has written a wonderful article about what happens when you're kind of stuck. And number one, he says nobody's paying much attention to the numbers. Some church leaders question whether numbers should really even be focused on. Is it idolatry? Others simply don't worry about attendance. In either case, the church may grow to its limits, but it will hit a limit. Talk to me, because I've been on both sides of this thing of focusing on numbers. Yeah. I mean, clearly, when I first got to Warnell, I focused on numbers constantly. And when I was planting churches, I totally focused on numbers. And now I'm at the place where I probably have moved too far to the other side. Be honest about it.
Yeah.
And I don't even care anymore.
Yep.
And that's not right either.
Yeah, right.
Okay?
Yep.
So talk to me about a balance between making numbers important and where do they fit in that? Now, I'll say this. I was with one guy one time, and he was leading the conference, and I was doing it too. We were tag teaming, so to speak. And he talked about how important it was to know how many people were in your church on Sunday morning. And he pastored a mega church, okay, one of the biggest in the nation, and had multiple services. And he knew exactly how many were there on Sunday morning. And I questioned him. I said, how do you know that? And he said, well, we have cameras in the sanctuary that take pictures of each section. And then on Monday, I have people who count how many were there, so I know to the number how many were there every Sunday morning.
Oh, man.
I'm thinking, dude, that's over the top. That's what I'm thinking, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if he asked me, how many did you have yesterday, I don't know.
Yes.
And that's probably not good either.
Right.
So help me.
Well, I think numbers, I don't think are neither good nor bad. And I think you're right. I think a lot of us, my story's similar, can go from one extreme to the other. So I think part of it is you've got to pick the right numbers to care about. we should care about how many disciples we're making, how many people are being discipled, right? How many sheep do we have to shepherd? I mean, for us at our church, we want to be really clear on who's in and who's not in our church, because as pastors, we're accountable for the souls under our care. Every sheep matters, from the nursery to the nursing home. So those numbers matter. Not so much from a worldly perspective, and a lot of this has to do with our hearts. Let's be honest, the posture of our hearts. If you see numbers as a way of winning or losing, that's the wrong paradigm.
Well, that's a
Does that
really
make sense?
good. Yeah, that's probably where I need to be thinking about it, because when I was focused on numbers, I was thinking of them as winning and losing, and when I don't want to focus on numbers,
that's right.
It's the same thing.
That's right. That's right.
That's a really good word,
because we use it as a competitive kind of measure,
or even in our own success rate.
That's right.
How successful am I?
Yeah. How much of a failure am I? Right? You
Yeah.
can go either way. Like
I said I don't care about numbers.
Yeah.
But I always do care about numbers.
Here's what I find myself doing, the way I pray for my church, and it's just this simple little prayer that God would increase our faith, that He would grow us in our faith, grow us deeper in the Word, and grow us greater in numbers. And when I started praying that, I felt a little guilty about that. Should I pray for numbers? And then it was like God said, "Have you noticed how many numbers there are in the Bible?" You know?
Yeah.
It's numbers. Numbers are a way of gauging what God is doing, and it's not a way of gauging what God is not doing. See, and so I used to have in fact, the first pastor that I had in my first full-time job in the ministry, go out and he'd count the number of cars in the parking lot every Sunday, and I always thought that was I still think it's funny. But, I asked him one day, why do you count the number of cars? He said, because I want to know how many families were here. And I thought, well, that's the reason for doing it. Who are you reaching? The numbers tell you about who you're reaching.
Right.
Not so much about how many as much as who you're reaching.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with having numbers be a motivator. I mean, I find guys who go to the extreme of we don't care about numbers at all. And it's exactly what we're having this conversation. There's no urgency to reach the lost. And so mission.
Almost a pride. And that numbers don't mean much to me.
That's right. Yeah. We're not one of those churches
We're
that
not
cares
one
about
of those
numbers.
churches.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I agree what Lawless says here, and put this in the show notes, this whole article. You can't make them idolatry, but you also can't ignore them to the case that you're not paying attention to what needs to be done.
That's good. Yep. Absolutely.
Number 2, the church has outgrown the pastor's leadership style.
Oh, boy.
Now listen, I think sometimes when you get in the doldrums and the church has just stopped moving, it's just sitting there. I love that doldrums kind of
It's a good
analogy.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Has the church outgrown the leadership style? Outgrown it numerically? Maybe even outgrown it in terms of its maturity? I mean, certain of us have ability for certain things.
Yes.
And sometimes God will grow us in that position. And sometimes He would have us move to another place and someone else come in. Sometimes there's a Paul and sometimes there's an Apollos.
Well said.
Okay?
Well said.
And if I'm not Apollos, Spurgeon, when he was talking about, we're in the Spurgeon Library, by the way, as we do these podcasts. My favorite Spurgeon sermon of all times is The Death of Moses. Look it up. And so he's talking about Moses and how he looked down and he saw Joshua down there. And Moses didn't fail. He did what God asked him to do. He took the children of Israel to the promised land. He didn't take them in, but that's what he asked them to do. And he said, Spurgeon said, what a tragedy to fail by remaining too long in office. In other words, he didn't remain too long. He didn't go past where God wanted him to go. You got to know when it's time to leave.
And that's so good. And that takes humility, it takes self-awareness. I think it's also, and this is true for all of us, and you've heard me say this before, every pastor is an interim pastor. It's just a matter of how long you're going to be there. And I think if we really care about what's best for a local congregation, we have to hold the position we hold as a pastor with open hands always. Because it might be just what you said, that my gifts, maybe I'm more of a starter.
I am a starter.
Get this thing going. You've done that forever.
Yeah.
Some guys are more plotters, and they're going to be faithful, and maybe that's what a church needs in a season.
And I was, we're here in Kansas City now, and I went to Warner Road, and I know it seems like it ages ago now, 2005, 2006, whatever, and at 18. Stayed there 10 years, maybe 120, 150 on the best Sunday with kids. But that was, I've never pastored a church of more than 150 on a consistent basis. Never. And so after 10 years, the Lord moved me to where I am now. A couple of other guys came in there. and today it's twice that large. And not only twice that large, it's twice as strong. I mean, it is that was not my role to do that, and that was someone else came in and did that. And that's okay. And you got to know what your strengths are and play to those and your leadership style.
Well, and I would say just being there with you, I love seeing your joy. When you go to Arnold, you're like a little kid
I
because
love
it's so cool to see what God's done. But that's also a reflection of your leadership of knowing when to pass the baton.
And by really passing the baton.
Yeah.
Okay,
But
go ahead.
there's a flip side to all of this also, and that is we're always changing. I mean, if you're growing, you're changing.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And so if the church has outgrown the pastor's leadership style, maybe it's time for you to change also.
That's true.
Not change positions, but change your leadership style.
That's true.
That's true. Well, I told you in a previous podcast that my whole ministry had been serial church planting. I would go in and start something, and within a couple of years, pass it off to a founding pastor. And then when I went to Warnell, I was going to stay there for a year or two and pass it off to a founding pastor. But that's when God really spoke to me and said, I want to do something in your life. You're going to stay here. So I got a secular job, became bivocational, stayed at Warnell for 10 years. That's crazy. I mean, that's 5 times longer than I ever stayed at any place. And so I stayed there for 10 years, and God really grew me into something. But at the end of that 10 years, he was done with me, and it needed to go to a whole different kind of leadership style. And I had to be fully aware of that and be grateful that I had the opportunity to move on and someone else could come in. Like I said, there was a Paul and Apollos, that kind of thing. And it's God who brings the growth regardless.
And by the way, that's hard to do too, because, I mean, if your church is growing and has grown, and then it suddenly reaches a plateau, or maybe not suddenly, but it reaches that plateau, but you've been part of that growth and that success,
Yes.
at least limited success, to walk away from that is a little hard.
That can be hard.
I've done it twice in my life, and it's excruciating. You know, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the third thing, and that is, and we're talking about reasons why churches get stuck and stop growing, and that is, the third thing is that the church is just out of space.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think especially parking can be a real issue for people. And then also just hallway space, gathering space. Yeah. We live in a time, look, most church architecture prior to the mid-century, prior to the 1960s, 1970s, the architecture was this: get you in the building, get you seated someplace, and then get you back out of the building. There was really no gathering space, no wide hallways, no sense of welcoming. Well, now people are accustomed to that. So if you've got one of those old buildings where there's no gathering space, the hallways are narrow, the aisle in the church is narrow, the pews are stuck real close together, it can feel confining. It doesn't feel like there's space to grow and space to breathe. So sometimes just reconfiguring your space, open it up, get rid of some classrooms you don't use anymore, make a greeting space, make a coffee space, take some pews out if you don't have that, if you don't fill every pew up, give people a little more room, obviously put chairs in if you can. You know, sometimes you're out of space because, I mean, that's pretty obvious. If you don't have enough places for people to sit, well, then you got to build your church building bigger. But I think sometimes the space you have feels constricted because of the way it's designed. It happened at Warnell. It's happened at other churches, at Linwood, the other churches I've been to. And it's amazing how you just sort of reconfigure it and make it look 2024 instead of 1964. And it seems more open, more welcoming. People feel more comfortable there. And I think that does have something to do with it.
Yeah, as an encouragement, though, I would say this also. If your church is out of space, man, first of all, that's a good problem to have. I mean, most churches don't have that problem.
That's true.
And we've talked about this before. I think a lot of younger people. So our church, this is where we're at now. You know,
you are out of space.
We're out of space.
Yeah, that's true.
And what that's done for us, though, is instead of building something bigger that we feel would change in many ways who we are in our philosophy of ministry, it's been fuel to plant new churches and to replant dying churches, to send. So I think you've got to think through just, because I think the old paradigm is, well, we got to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, maybe not. Or maybe, and so I think you need to think through what you're sacrificing. You
got to get more and more and more.
I was part of a church that did a major building project, and I'll never forget it, we moved into this huge sanctuary, and that church began to decline that day. Because everything that made that church great, the pastoral care, you were tight, there was an excitement, there's an energy. You know this. I mean, that's why we could go anywhere in Kansas City tonight and go to a concert. It'll be packed out with young people. They love that vibe.
Yeah.
So part of it is know who you are, know who the church is, be careful about what you're going to sacrifice by getting bigger. Again, I get that there's times you've got to figure it out, so I'm not trying to negate that. But I am saying, don't just get bigger because that's what somebody told you should do.
And I think when we talk about doldrums or plateaued, I go back to what I said a moment ago. I do think look at your church architecture and what's it say about the current trends and way people are, and does it look like, as I said, Rainer and I when we talk about going into church consultants, and you walk into a place and you ask yourself, what year is it? If it looks like it's 1974, what does that communicate to young people, to people who are looking for something that relates to them right now? Look, it's not the answer to everything, but do an audit on your building, and is there a way you can make it more usable and less confining? I think that can help you move past that doldrum sometimes.
There's simple, cheap ways to do it.
Look,
that's the thing. You don't have to do some building project.
Okay, so when we went to Linwood, we had this little wing of 5 Sunday school classrooms. They were like 12 by 12, right? Like little tiny classrooms. That's the way they built them in the 1950s. It was right off the sanctuary. So the first thing we did was we got rid of all those classrooms, made a huge open space, and we put a kitchen at the front. And so our kitchen and our coffee area is adjacent to our sanctuary. So what's that mean? Now when people come in, instead of just sort of walking through a narrow door and setting in a small sanctuary, now they walk in and there's this big open space, half the size of the sanctuary, with the tables that are high top tables and coffee and juice and donuts. And so they come and they engage with each other. It's very warm. It's very 2024. And people walk in and they immediately go, something's happening here, because this doesn't look like on the inside like it looks like on the outside, right? And then people tend to stay longer, communicate longer, build community. Those things are important.
They are.
Now, where do you have Sunday school? Well, we just use the school next door, and we rent that for Sunday school space. They just need that 1 hour a week, but the other place we get so that's what I mean about.
I love it.
Maybe your church is in the doldrums. Take your building and can you repurpose it in a way that encourages discipleship and fellowship and those kinds of things. All right. Number 4, this is a good one, Mark. You got small groups. Your small groups have sort of maxed out. They've sort of run their space. Sometimes churches start small groups and they begin with a lot of excitement. How do you maintain small groups?
Well, man, that's a great question. Here's what we've done.
And that may be Sunday school or small group. Either one.
Right.
Either one.
And I think what we've seen over the 15 years I've been there is our group ministry has changed what it looks like. So originally when I came, we did what we called community groups, and everybody was in a community group, intergenerational, share a meal, sermon-based discussion. It's kind of your typical traditional small group kind of strategy. And it was great for the first 2 or 3 years. And then we began to see that, you know what, there were women approaching me and say, hey, could we do something beyond this and do more of a discipleship group? Because that's a little different than sharing a meal together, and we had some men who wanted to do that. And so, let's try that. Well, just point being, over time, we've morphed into basically we have 3 different types of groups now. So we do still have community groups, but then we have a lot of discipleship groups that are gender specific, 3 to 5 men, 3 to 5 women. And then what we have, we call family dinners. And literally, so we once a month just sign up and you're going to go to somebody's house and you'll join 2 or 3 other families just to have one night. It's not a long time commitment, especially if you're new. Well, point being, there's different types of groups meeting different needs. And that would be my encouragement. You've got to keep it fresh. Don't put your foot in there and say, hey, well, we're doing small groups, Donna, because I read this book and that's what you're supposed to do. Well, that's great. We want small groups, but are they effective? Are they getting? What's the point?
Do you have people in different groups that might be in 2 different groups?
Yeah. So we will. Yeah. So those who want to be, sometimes they'll be in a community group and be in a Bible study, and then I guess a 4th environment we have is what we call the Calvary Institute, which is more of our traditional classroom setting of learning and this kind of thing, for those who desire that. So. Again, as we've gotten older, our approach has been, instead of trying to make one-size-fits-all group, because we tried that card for a while and our percentages were going way down. And so you can either say, well, this is what we do, get on board, or don't. I would rather say, man, I'm here to serve the people. How can we help scratch where it's itching? Because what we know is in every one of our groups, there's community happening, there's relationships that are forming, people are being encouraged, and there's some discipleship happening. So
that's good stuff, man.
I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it's extremely helpful, because I think small groups often will get started and then they'll just hit a plateau. Sunday school will get started, and you'll find Sunday school that's just totally plateaued.
Same thing.
And the whole point of Sunday school back at the turn of the 20th century when it first started, late 19th century, 20th century, was to always be bringing new people in. It was an outreach thing.
Gotcha.
And so that was, okay.
Okay, I'm gonna call an audible here.
Yeah.
Because
We're
running
running out of time. So let's make this a
Part one.
two-parter.
Yeah.
A two-parter.
It's good stuff.
And
All
why
right.
don't we do this? Why don't we?
Are we on number 5?
We're starting number 5, which is church leaders are not raising up new leaders, but that's going to take too much time to talk about.
Okay.
All right, so we'll do
let's-
that next time.
Yeah, let's do that next time.
Love it.
So to recap, Mark and Dan, why churches reach the doldrums, why they end up stagnant, among other things, either paying too much attention to numbers and focused on that too much and really losing your sight, or not paying enough attention, having a balanced understanding of numbers. The leadership style of the pastor can't keep up with the church growth. He's reached his max. The church space is not being well used, and your small groups have sort of played themselves out. Those are the first 4 we looked at, but we'll look at 6 more if the Lord doesn't return. If he does, we'll be gone, but the podcast will still be on.
So yeah,
But at that point, it doesn't really help you anyway.
You can hear all the repeats, Yeah. So thank you all so much, and thank you to North American Mission Board for making this possible. We really appreciate those folks, and they've been so good to make it possible to make this happen. And of course, we are in the Spurgeon Library.
Yes, we are.
At Midwestern Baptist.
You should come here and see it. It's not just books.
They got a new
It's
pulpit.
unbelievable.
They have the pulpit from the Methodist church where he was converted.
Yep.
They have a pew from the Methodist church where he was converted. They went over to London and they visited this church, and these things were still there. They have the doorknob and handle from Spurgeon's office. They have. They do.
I know.
They do.
They've got his pipe.
They got his pipe.
Yeah.
They've got actually.
They've got it all.
And they sell souvenir pipes here.
They
too.
do. They do. No, it's a great place. So if you're ever in Kansas City, this is a Southern Baptist institution paid for by the cooperative program, and you ought to really enjoy it.
Did
And
you
it's
tell?
doing a
Did you
great
say
job.
something about they got what was
The communion set? They just received a communion set.
Was that from the Methodist church? Or?
No, it's from the Tabernacle.
Oh,
so
wow.
yeah. Anyway, you'll just have to come and see all this.
Pretty
And
neat.
it is pretty close. It is. I like it a lot.
It's impressive.
It
So
is.
thank you all so much for listening. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on Revitalize and Replant. This podcast is brought to you by the North American Mission Board, where we help dying or struggling churches regain health for the glory of God and the good of their communities. If you found this conversation helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. To learn more about becoming a replanting pastor or to explore resources about revitalization for your own church, visit churchreplanters.com.